Alright, so we have a new Indiana Jones movie that has come out, and the plot for it is pretty much this. Archaeologist Indiana Jones races against time to retrieve a legendary artifact that can change the course of history. Alright, let's get into the good parts of this movie, and the first thing I'm going to be saying is that Harrison Ford is really great in this movie. This potentially might be his last movie in general. Obviously, this is his last Indiana Jones movie, but like I said, this could be his last movie in general because he seems to be leaning more towards television. And although the writing for this movie is a bit off at times, I think that Harrison Ford does the absolute best that he can with the material he's given. And everyone else for the most part was also really good, but another person that stuck out to me was Mads Mikkelsen. And he also gives it 110%, and he was a really good villain for this movie. Was kind of intimidating at times, but he wasn't a great Indiana Jones villain, and it's not because of him, it's more so just writing. And also, he only has like one emotion or one type of like mindset in this movie, which is to try and get the dial, but we don't really learn that much about him as a character, so for that reason he's just kind of a generic villain at times. And going back to what I said about Harrison Ford's performance, there's a lot of like emotional moments in this movie. Indiana Jones in this movie has gone through a lot of stuff, which I'm not going to mention, but there's a lot of moments where Harrison Ford was actually giving a really emotional performance that actually got to me at times. A lot of people have been like mad about Indiana Jones being like a depressed and grumpy old man, but that actually kind of worked for this movie because this seems like something that could happen to Indiana Jones in this movie, while when it happened in The Last Jedi, that kind of just went against what Luke Skywalker was for me. The action for this movie was also really well done for me. Most of the action sequences were well done, especially in the first hour and a half of the movie. Once we get to the final hour, that's when stuff starts being a bit too questionable for me. But once again, the first hour and a half, all of the action scenes for that were really well done. But the best part of the movie and the best action sequence of the movie for me was the first 20-30 minutes because it was just really well done. Although Harrison Ford's like CGI face was a bit off at times. And also, by the way, they didn't use Indy's old voice for this. They literally just used Harrison Ford's like 80-year-old voice, which was also very hard for me to pay attention at times because you see Indiana Jones as his like middle-aged self, but then you hear the voice of this elderly man, so it's just kind of a weird combination for me. And while I was watching the movie, I was thinking to myself that this 30-minute sequence could have just been its own movie, and it's not that the overall movie is bad, but that 30 minutes was so great that I wanted to see more of that. The pacing for this movie is probably the only thing that I would put on par with the original Steven Spielberg trilogy because, oh my god, this movie goes by really quickly. And even though, like I said, the final hour of this movie is a bit questionable for me and I'm still thinking about it right now, I still think that the pacing for that final act was extremely good. And the last thing I'll say before I get into my criticisms is that John Williams' score is really great. I know that surprises absolutely no one, so let's get into the criticisms. The first thing I'll say is that Helena in this movie is very annoying, but I would say she was very annoying for like the first like couple minutes of the movie. I don't think she's as annoying as everyone's been saying she is, but she is very annoying at times. And her relationship with Indiana Jones in this movie is really hard to root for because literally like 70 to 80% of the movie they're literally just bickering. And at times, the movie does show that they do care about each other, but I wish we could have got more of that side instead of them bickering like it's an MCU movie. The comedy for this movie was not funny at all, and in fact, the movie is actually really funny when it's not trying to be funny, but when you can see that they're trying to crack jokes, it just didn't work for me personally. Another criticism that I have for this movie is the third act, and I'm not going to say too much because it's spoilers, but let's just say it has to do with like time travel, and the way they did it wasn't bad, but it was just generic, and that's when the movie went from like, oh, this is like kind of a good time to like, okay, now it's just a painfully boring final act of an action movie. But the end of that like third act was actually really emotional, and I was actually on the edge of my seat. But since I'm still talking about the third act, I might as well throw in that this one didn't have the crazy final act that the other Indiana Jones movies had, including Crystal Skull. And I'm talking about the time traveling sequence that happens, but what I'm going to say for that is that it was kind of anticlimactic for me. The cinematography is definitely a mixed bag for me because there's a lot of sequences where I'm like, this is really well shot, and then there's other sequences where I'm like, this is very bland and boring, and there's a lot more bland and boring shots than there are amazing shots. And if you had to guess the budget for this movie, I guarantee that none of you would be able to tell me that it was almost $300 million. The last thing I'll say before I give my score is that Antonio Banderas and the character Mason and obviously Sala are all in this movie, but they're barely in this movie. And although it's because certain things happen to these characters, I really do wish that we could have got more of these characters because they were some of the more interesting characters in this movie. And overall, guys, I don't think that Indiana Jones 5 is as great as the audience is saying it is, but I don't think it's as bad as the critics are saying it is. But I do think that somewhere in this movie there was a really great movie, but due to Lucasfilm's interference, we'll never get to see or know how great this movie could have been.